Welcome back. Hope you enjoyed the long lunch that we gave you. We have two more topics on 50.4 that we're going to discuss, and then we will have discussed all of the laws and authorities at 50.4. And then we will discuss environmental assessment factors, and then we'll throw it over to Rick to discuss
Conducting a site
conducting a site assessment and then answering those radon questions as well. So first we'll start off with the Farmland Protection Policy Act right now. And it is required, compliance is required by 50.4J and is discussed in the map guide at 9.5P. Okay, just an overview of the Farmland Protection Policy Act. If a project would convert important farmland to a non-agricultural use, then the USDA's Natural Resource Conservation Service must be consulted. And its purpose is to minimize the unnecessary and irreversible conversion of farmland to non-agricultural uses. What we were seeing was a lot of projects, a lot of federally funded projects were converting farmland, prime important farmland. And so this act goes to help prevent that federal funds used to convert farmland. Potential triggers are the 221D4 and any new construction project, and also the acquisition of undeveloped land. This is a great slide to illustrate the point that we were trying to make. The green area is the high quality farmland that has low development, but you can see it is being encroached. The red is the high quality farmland that has high development and is being converted over to a developed area instead of farmland uses. This is just to try to illustrate so you can see where the areas are of concern. The steps of the farmland process are pretty straightforward. I have them listed here, but I'm going to go to the next slide. It's the steps in the flowchart process, and so you can actually see them a little bit better instead of being so wordy. So step one in the process is whether or not your project is new construction or acquisition of undeveloped land. If your project does not consist of new construction or acquisition of undeveloped land, your project is in compliance, it's exempt from the FPPA, and you can just document that and move forward. If your project is new construction or acquisition of undeveloped land, then you go to step two. Step two, the question that you ask is your site committed to urban development? And this is a specific category, committed to urban development, and we're going to talk about exactly what that means in just a few minutes. So if your project is not committed to urban development, then you will need to go forward. If your project is converted to urban development, then you're in compliance and you don't have to go any further. It's exempt from the FPPA. And then you go to step three. Does your project involve important farmland in step three? We also will talk about what important farmland means on a specific project site. If your project does involve important farmland, then you will have to consult with the NRCS. If your project does not involve important farmland, it is exempt and you are in compliance, and document that, and you are done with the environmental requirements for the Farmland Protection Policy Act. Okay, now we're going to take each of those steps in turn. This is step one, the threshold, and discussing exactly what new construction. Remember that there are other new construction projects besides 221D4, but that is the one that we see most common in multifamily housing. But all new construction projects and acquisition of undeveloped land. If it's a 223F or a 223A7, it's exempt and is in compliance, and you're done. So if it is new construction or acquisition of undeveloped land, we're going to go to step two. Okay, now you remember I said, is your project committed to urban development? And that is specific to this Census Bureau maps. Only the Census Bureau will designate whether a site is committed to urban development. It doesn't matter if the local zoning has committed it to urban use or for residential or anything like that. It has to be the Census Bureau's maps at this website. And you can see on the left where the map layers are, there's a checkbox on urban areas. That's the box you want to make sure and check. And the areas in blue are urban areas. The areas in white are not committed to urban development. So if you are in the blue area, if your project's in the blue area, you are in compliance. If you are in the white area, you will need to move forward to step three. Step 3 is to identify whether or not your project has important farmland contained on it. Again, there's a specific website that you want to go to. It's the USDA's Web Soil Survey website. Important farmland, we're talking about prime farmland, unique farmland, and farmland of statewide importance. It's all together considered important farmland. If you go to the USDA's website, it is very easy to use. It is address driven, but you can also use latitude and longitude to find out where your project is located. And as you can see on this map, the red area is not important farmland. So if your project was in the red area, you could say, my project does not include important farmland. I am done. I am exempt from the FPPA process, and I don't have to move any forward. Okay, step 4. And this is an example, this is a real-life example of a project that I just reviewed for a 221D4 new construction project. As you can see at the bottom of the map is the urban areas on the Census Bureau's map in red. The project is located in not in an urban area. It's one little section of white within an urban area, but that is not designated as urban. And then also above that, you can see when I pulled up the soil survey map for that project location, the green and the blue areas are important farmland. And these designations, you'll have these designations on the maps when you actually get there and look at these and get used to using these map tools. So in this case, if your project is not committed to urban development and it involves important farmland, then you're actually going to work with technical support to complete a form called AD 1006 Farmland Conversion Impact Rating. And it requires consultation with the NRCS. This form is something that you complete in consultation with the NRCS together, and then you come up with an impact rating. And I'm not going to go into that information now, but if you do have a project that involves consultation with the NRCS, you definitely want to get your technical support involved. Okay, final documentation for the farmlands, for the FPPA documentation. First, you want to, if your project is exempt, you want to document why it's exempt. So it's an exempt activity, such as a building rehab, or 223A7 or 223F. It's an exempt location, such as it's in an urban area, or there's no important farmland on the project site, and you have the soil survey map to show that. If your project is not exempt, then you're going to have to show consultation with the NRCS and the completed AD 1006 Farmland Conversion Impact Rating. For more information on our farmland protection compliance requirements, please go to our HUDexchange.info right here on this website. Okay, I think we are going to environmental justice now, and it is the last of the 50.4 laws and authorities.
Last one. So environmental justice is required by 50.4L. I think that's an L, not an uppercase I. And in the map guide, it's at chapter 9.5N. I don't know if you have actually necessarily been noticing, but we've been going through the map guide in order. But this one we've actually taken out of order. And we've put environmental justice at the end, not because it's not important, but because it should really be the last component of your environmental analysis that you do. You should be really doing your environmental justice analysis kind of through the lens of your full environmental review with all the other pieces complete. So our environmental justice policies come from Executive Order 12898, which requires all federal agencies to identify and address disproportionately high and adverse human health and environmental impacts of their activities on minority and low-income populations. Historically, these are the populations that are most likely to live in unsafe and unhealthy environments, and given our mission at HUD, it's something that's really critical to us to address. It's also something that can get a lot of attention from the public and the media if it isn't properly addressed, so don't just blow this one off. Environmental justice should be a consideration of all HUD projects. Whoops, sorry. There's a misconception that market rate projects don't need to include an environmental justice analysis because they don't necessarily include low-income people, but that may not be true, and also doesn't take into account minority populations. environmental justice concerns not only low income, but also minority populations. And sorry, I didn't move to this slide earlier. HUD has an environmental justice strategy, which we issued in 2012. So this is a priority of this administration. And again, like NEPA and Part 50, you can see that this really summarizes our goals for the environmental review process generally. Environmental justice is about making sure that that people have access to safe and healthy housing, mitigating risk to communities in disaster-prone areas, there's access to housing free of hazards, and that we have inclusive, sustainable communities free of discrimination. If you want to look more at that environmental justice strategy, there's a link here to it on our website. So what do you actually do to comply with Executive Order 12898 and our environmental justice policies? First, you're going to determine whether your project presents an environmental justice concern, and there are two kind of sub-steps to that. A, you're going to ask it whether there are any adverse environmental impacts, and then B, ask whether those impacts will have a disproportionate impact on low-income or minority populations. And this is one of those determinations that has to be made by HUD. So none of the partners, your lenders, third-party providers, they can't make that determination. This is HUD's role to make that determination. Now, if your answer to step one is that yes, there is an environmental justice concern here, then you'll need to work with technical support to resolve those issues. Generally, you're going to want to mitigate to eliminate or at least reduce the negative impacts that could affect your environmental justice population. So breaking down step one, determining if the project actually presents an environmental justice concern. The first part of that first step is going to be asking if the project creates adverse environmental impacts. So asking both, if the site or the surrounding neighborhood suffer from adverse environmental conditions, and then also whether this proposed project will create adverse environmental impacts or aggravate an existing impact. So this could be anything. I'd focus especially on those things that could harm residents or negatively impact their quality of life, like toxics, contamination, explosive hazards, elevated noise levels, or floodplains. But really look at the sum of the environmental review and any negative impacts that came up over the course of the full environmental review. Now, moving on to the kind of second half of step one, you'll ask if there are any adverse environmental impacts. You'll ask if they affect a low-income or minority community. So look at whether this community has less than 60% of area mean income, or there's an appreciably higher percentage minority than in the jurisdiction in general. So for this, you should be looking at census data and state and local demographic data. This isn't something that you can just cover on your site visit. It might help, but just a windshield survey alone is not going to be sufficient here. NEPA Assist is a good tool that provides census data, but you'll want to have some concrete data. Just to kind of summarize that, we have some common scenarios in HUD projects. This is how these most often arise. If your environmental report identifies adverse health impacts like, again, unacceptable noise levels, site contamination, a danger zone for explosive and flammable hazards, or a special flood hazard area, and that impact is disproportionately higher to an environmental justice community, this will by definition apply to affordable housing. You should also take a close look at any projects with low-income housing tax credits, or also if there's just in general a low-income or minority neighborhood. Then you're going to need to continue to step two and make sure that you're addressing these environmental justice issues. So our next step is to take steps to minimize your environmental justice impacts. You'll need to advise the lender of any environmental justice concerns, including recommendations to resolve the issues, and then work with technical support to either avoid or mitigate these impacts. And you should involve the public. and have them approve an environmental justice mitigation plan if it makes it to that level. So here's a little example. We have a project site that looks to be really close to a tank farm that might have some explosive or flammable hazards. I'm actually a railroad, yeah, I'm thinking, which that's going to be a noise impact, especially if this is a place trains are stopping. They might be blowing their whistles. So these are all things that could be negative triggers to environmental justice issues. We can't really answer whether this is an environmental justice community. We don't have any census data here, so we're not positive. We need to look at the numbers to say whether we have an environmental justice concern, but that's definitely a red flag that this site is not ideal. And to sum up, here's your documentation you'll need for environmental justice. You'll either need evidence that this isn't an environmental justice issue because there weren't any environmental conditions that were a problem, or evidence that there's no environmental justice community that is being disproportionately affected. But if there is an environmental justice concern, you'll need documentation that the community has been informed and meaningfully involved in the planning process to address any impacts. And now I think I'll turn it back to Laura for environmental assessments.
Okay, great. Now that we've finished environmental justice, you're going to see that we have covered everything in 50.4. So this is also what you may be familiar with as Part A of the 4128. And so we have complied with all sections of Part A of the 4128. So this section is the environmental assessment factors that you will see we're talking about is Part B. Now I put this slide back up. You may remember it from yesterday with Liz, but it's very important and critical that you understand where we are now in the process. So we've already talked about categorically excluded, not subject to 50.4 projects. That's our 223A7s. And we've talked about categorically excluded subject to 50.4 projects, our 223Fs. Now we've also included these environmental assessment projects, the 221D4s, as well as those listed at the bottom here. But what is special about the 221D4s and those other new construction projects listed there is that they require not only compliance with 50.4, but also these environmental assessment factors that we're going to be discussing now. Here are some resources that I wanted to put up first. We've been talking about our HUD Exchange website as a resource, which is really good. The Environmental Assessment Factors Guidance is really what I'm going to be going over here now, almost word for word for your information. These are the kind of things that need to be considered when going through an environmental assessment factors. This is how the environmental assessment factors look in HEROES. We're going to be going over each of these. This is where you would input that information in HEROES. Okay, I want to just let you know that what I'm going to be doing here is going over these different factors, environmental assessment factors, but what I'm going to be doing is asking questions. And I please beg your forgiveness that I'm going to be reading actually some of these questions because I want to make sure that you understand what we're talking about. But I'm not going to be answering the questions. The only way that can be answered is by the site-specific evaluation. So these are the things that need to be considered in the environmental assessment, and this is what I'm going to be going over next. So the first one that we're going to look at is land development. We're also going to look at, under land development, compatible uses, compatible land uses, zoning and urban design, and some questions that we want to consider are: what is the current zoning classification of the project location? What is the existing land use at the project location? How does the project relate to existing land uses? How does the project fit or conform with the surrounding environment? And will there be intrusion of elements out of character or scale with the existing physical environment? This is just questions I want you to keep in mind as we go through this process. The next sections in land development cover erosion, soil suitability, and slope. Is there evidence of erosion or sedimentation on or near the project site? Is an erosion control plan included as part of the construction and the construction contract? Is there evidence of ground subsidence, seismic activity, a high water table, or other unusual conditions at the site? Is there any visible evidence of soil problems in the neighborhood of the project site, such as foundation cracking, settling, or basement flooding? Is there a history of slope failure in the project area? Next, under land development is drainage, stormwater runoff, and hazards and nuisances. Will existing or planned stormwater disposal and treatment systems adequately service the proposed development? Will the proposed project be adversely affected by proximity to these facilities? Will the project be impacted by hazards or nuisances, whether natural or man-made? And just a note on this one, if you find something that seems dangerous and you do not see it covered in any of the previous laws and authorities that we've discussed, then it belongs here under the hazards and nuisances. For example, our explosive regulations do not cover fertilizer plants or grain elevators, but both are very dangerous and should be considered here if they are near the project site. Common sense is very useful when evaluating a project. So if you see anything that is out of the ordinary or looks dangerous or causes the hairs on the back of your neck to stand up, make sure that you ask questions about it and include it here in this section on the environmental assessment. Okay, next under land development is energy consumption and energy efficiency. Are there energy resources of the utility provider sufficient to support the project? Are renewable energy strategies being implemented in this project? Is the project being designed and constructed to meet the current version of the Energy Star performance standards? Is the location of the project in close proximity to transit, shopping, services, and employment locations? Are there state and federal rebates or tax incentives for energy efficiency strategies? And are renewable energy components being considered? Next, after land development, we're going to be looking at socioeconomic factors. The first of these is displacement and also employment and income patterns. Will the project directly displace individuals or families? Does the project contribute to reducing or significantly altering the racial, ethnic, or income segregation of the area's housing? Will the project either significantly increase or decrease temporary and/or permanent employment opportunities? The next one we have here are community facilities and services, and I want to just make a quick point on these before I get into to the actual questions. A lot of times I would review these projects and I would see something like, no, the project isn't going to impact, the churches or the education facilities or the water resources. But we want to make sure that we're looking at it both ways. We're not looking at just directly impacts, but we're also looking at the capacity of these services. And so that's what we're really trying to focus on here. Okay, so under community facilities and services, what types and amounts of waste are being generated as construction debris? What organization will handle garbage collection, composting, and recycling? Will the waste from the proposal exceed the capacity of the waste system or landfill? Will the increase in population from the proposed development increase the need for area healthcare services beyond current capacities? Are there social services located on-site or within a convenient and reasonable distance to residents of the proposed project? And is adequate public transportation available from the project to these services? Sorry, we just discussed that one. I'm a little behind. Okay, water supply and wastewater and sanitary applications. Will either the municipal or private water utility on-site or on-site water supply be adequate to serve the proposed project? Is the water supply quality safe from a chemical and bacteriological standpoint? What kind of wastewater and sewer systems are available, and will they provide satisfactory service to the proposal? Does the existing or proposed sewer system have the capacity to adequately service the proposed development? We've got a couple more in community facilities and services that we'll talk about. The next is park recreation emergency services. Are open space and recreational and cultural facilities within a reasonable walking distance to the project area? Or is adequate public transportation available from the project to these facilities? Are there special recreational and cultural needs of certain population groups to be satisfied, such as small children, the elderly, or handicapped? Will the proposed project overload existing open space, recreational, or cultural facilities? What emergency services are located within a reasonable proximity to the proposed project site? What is the approximate response time? Will the project create a significant burden on police, fire, or healthcare providers in terms of manpower or equipment? As far as transportation and accessibility, is the project served by a safe and adequate public transportation service? Will the existing and reasonably foreseeable transportation facilities services be adequate to meet the needs of the project? Will the project itself cause a significant adverse impact on the local or regional transportation system? Does the project require a traffic study? Has one already been performed? Are there any actions taken? Are there any actions identified in the study that need to be taken? And the last one that we'll look at are natural features. Will the project location, construction, or its users adversely impact the unique or locally important natural features on or near the project site? Will the project create problems by introducing nuisance species or vegetation that may be ecologically disruptive to the area? Will the project damage or destroy trees without replacement and landscaping? Okay. As we discussed, all of this information should be provided by the lender in the environmental report. So remember, if it's a 221D4 new construction or a project that is a substantial rehab and requires a full environmental assessment, all this information should be provided in the environmental report. And we just wanted to make sure that you had information on the questions that are considered on the Part B. So that was Part B of the 4128 and the environmental assessment factors. And so next we're going to go to Rick on conducting site visits.
And I believe we may also have some questions that are sitting in the queue. So do we want to take a few minutes and see what's in there?
Sounds good.
Radon question. If a unit tests greater than 4.0 picocuries per liter the first time and when retested is 4.0, so the average of the two tests is 4.0, does the unit have to be mitigated? And oh, I'm sorry. The first one is greater and the second one is less than 4.0. Well, obviously, if it tests the average test below 4.0, then the unit does not have to be mitigated. If both testings come in at 4.0, then the average is 4.0 and it would have to be mitigated. And obviously, you're looking at the same unit needs to be tested. And if it's a short-term test, those short-term tests have to be seasonal, at least 3 months apart, so that there would be a change. If there's a long-term test of 91 days or greater, then that supersedes a short-term test, and it's not an averaging. I hope this answers your question. Do we have any others? None. Okay.
Keep the questions coming. We can always make time for questions at the end.
Yes. I had a couple of clarifications beforehand. I was talking to Dan Sullivan. He likes to use a term, taste the dirt, and that is not to be literally translated. That is...
metaphorically speaking?
Yes. Walk the site, the neighborhood, do a thorough site walk. I don't know of anybody who actually tastes dirt, but we get, the environmental professionals can get fairly close to it. I know that when you're taking out an underground storage tank, one of the things that they do, somebody jumps into the bottom, grab the soil, squeeze it, see if anything comes out, smell it, see if they can smell petroleum or hydrocarbons, but I don't believe anybody is actually tasting the dirt, and we would not recommend that you do that either. The second is our always concern about travel funds and money when conducting site inspections. There will always be travel funds available, particularly since site inspections are considered a necessary component of our environmental review process. If you're having trouble with travel funds, you need to talk to your administrative people and have them get together with headquarters personnel, and money will be freed up, or we'll find out why the money isn't available in a timely manner. But there shouldn't be any cost prohibitions and somebody telling you that you can't get out there. On the other hand, we would expect everybody to conduct site inspections in a timely and an efficient manner. I had to fly up to Buffalo and It was an overnight, but I took an extra day in order to drop down into Erie, PA, 2.5 hours away to conduct a second site inspection. Since I was overloaded with work, my site inspection in Erie, PA was then picked up, and the environmental review process was handled by another appraiser in the office. But for that reason, we were working efficiently. One person, 2 sites, get it done. In speaking with appraisers around the country, very often they're going out doing 5 and 6 sites, and they're out there on multiple days. It's just the way we do business. Hopefully this answers any or addresses any of your concerns. So we're moving on to conducting environmental site inspections. The target audience for this is you new underwriters, former project managers who perhaps haven't conducted site inspections or had any experience in the field. You appraisers, basically you've been doing this as long as you've been an appraiser, you've been conducting site inspections. Very often you've been going out in the field with other technicians, the construction analysts. I know I've always learned a great deal when about foundation and building requirements when I've been in the field with construction analysts, architects, et cetera, and hopefully they've picked up some of our good practices as well. But there is some reasoning behind how and why appraisers are doing site inspections and not other disciplines. So we'll start with that. The traditional role of the appraiser is to inspect the property and undertake how the project relates to the neighborhood and how the neighborhood community influences value. So these are all value-driven ideas. And when I get into it, I was taught back in 1998 by Jack Bonkowski. He was our headquarters environmental officer. Before he retired, shortly after I came on board, I did have the opportunity to sit down and talk with him for about an hour a week. And some of these very basic questions were the first ones on my list. As he taught me, it was an appraiser is looking inward at the project, and everybody else is concerned with collateral and mortgageable items, everything on the subject site. But the appraiser needs to know about value and is also looking at neighborhood influences, adjacent property uses, how the subject property fits into the neighborhood, and then how the neighborhood fits into the community. So that's the prime reason why appraisers in the past have been tasked with doing site inspections and completing the HUD 4128. Beyond that, there is no requirement, though, that only an appraiser can do the site inspection, and very real reason behind our training is that as the appraisers, as technicians, become more involved with higher level case studies and projects, D4, new construction, sub-rehab, where we're getting into marketability issues. If it's a no-brainer, no recs or vecs on the site, no other compliance factors, at least as far as the lender knows, then it may be appropriate for the underwriter to go out and conduct the site inspection and fulfill the role of the appraiser doing the environmental. And even perhaps some of the valuation analyses if there aren't valuation issues and red flags. It's also particularly important if a cost analyst architect is going out, there may be a necessary reason. A lot of critical and non-critical repairs, but the appraisal function, environmental, is very basic. So perhaps you'll be tasked with this as well. So the training is really targeting you two audiences. Basically, prior to the site inspection, you really have to have a working knowledge of your issues. There's nothing more frustrating than to go out into the field and start reading your 4128 if it was provided and your phase one and realizing that you didn't allocate enough time in the area. So you should have a working knowledge of your issues, whether there are recognized environmental conditions and vapor encroachment conditions on site and adjacent uses off-site. The heads up again is going to be in the phase one ESA in the summary and the findings, opinions, and conclusions section. But you'll also see it in the lender's narrative, what the lender considers relevant and important, but that has to be cross-checked versus the phase one. And of course, both of these documents are going to be cross-checked once you get to the site. You're going to be walking in the footsteps of the environmental professional, and you really want to see if you agree with them. You're looking at the same property. Are you seeing the same environmental factors? It's a good idea at this point to pre-populate HEROES, get a working knowledge of it, get it up and running. There's basic information that always needs to be input on the project, the size and complexity. As I mentioned before, until you're really comfortable making site inspections, I would bring a hard copy of the sample field notes checklist. It has been replaced electronically with HEROES, and HEROES does have information on site inspections, but this is a fairly thorough document. You can just make a copy of it, and whether you populate it in the field, you can bring it back and use it as notes. Or in those instances where one HUD staff is doing the field inspection and somebody else is coming back, or rather in the office, and completing the HEROES submission and signing and certifying to it, I would take or use a sample field notes checklist signed by the HUD staff that did the site inspection and upload that as evidence that we, HUD, completed the site inspection. When you're ready to go out, courtesy call to the project to make an appointment. They usually need up to 3 days advance notice because you will be going into units, not just vacant units. And there are requirements from the asset management side and management side itself. And more than that, just as good policy, we always have a lot of people wanting to use very few HUD cars. So if I'm driving to the site, before I set up my site inspection, I want to make sure that I know what days the car is available. It's just a good practice. Nothing's more frustrating than to set up an appointment with a difficult client, difficult because of their schedule, and then you can't get a car. You discuss early matters with HUD staff as appropriate. Again, if you're the underwriter, you may be talking to the appraiser and the architect. As an appraiser, if I'm the only one going out, particularly when I was working on RAD projects, I'd call up the underwriter because they're trying to visualize what I'm going to be seeing. And they may have some questions. When I was working out in Pennsylvania, I spent an extra hour going through everything, and then was on the phone to the Boston underwriter in HUD, answering all those questions and seeing if there's anything else relevant that he wanted me to look at. So this is very much a group effort. We're doing the underwriting and the single point of contact, but we're a team and we all work together in an efficient manner. I tend to take, this is for vacant land when I'm doing a site inspection. You're going to end up walking the perimeter and the interior. Vacant land is sometimes the easiest and sometimes the most difficult to deal with. I'm dressed in a two-piece suit. I would not go into the field with a suit, dressed to kill. I'm going to be going there in blue jeans and boots and a shirt that may or may not survive the site inspection. Keep that in mind. You're going to refer to the Phase 1 ESA during the inspection, so bring it along. It's something that there's just so much information and you really can't summarize it. It's, I bring the first 50 to 80 pages of it and I know what I'm looking for. I've already gone through it and highlighting. And when you get to vacant land, it has a frustrating quality to it. Sometimes it's surrounded by other vacant land and there aren't many points of contact. Where does your vacant land start and where do the adjacent properties end? So local and regional maps are good, but so are tax maps that show the taxable parcels and which constitutes your site, and bring along any surveys that are available. As Laura talked about environmental factors, you're going to be looking at unique and natural features of the site. You're going to note the terrain features, the slope and drainage. Drainage isn't merely how our property drains. It may be draining onto an adjacent property, which creates possible litigation, but we also want to be aware of if adjacent sites are draining onto ours and causing slope erosion or high water table, or if we're going to be building there, if we're going to have issues with flooding. Are there visual indications of filled ground, old foundations, or past uses? At this point, basically, you're going to be walking the perimeter, but you have to get to the interior, and that does not mean that you're going into the very center and saying you've done your job. You're going to be crisscrossing across the property. And one of the things that I always look for, if I've already looked at the site maps and everything, and if I know that there's a brook or wetlands, likely floodplains, I'm going to go there. That has to be eyeballed. You're looking at site suitability, access, and compatibility with surrounding developments. I want to know if I've got a 3-lane highway and my only access is in one direction, and I have to drive a mile or 2 miles down in either direction in order to get turn around and get back to the site. There's going to be a marketability issue with that, and there may be a reason why there's vacant land on one side of the highway and all the development is on the other side. It may have access and compatibility issues. Nuisances and hazards are kind of dealt with in a more important manner. They deal with high tension wires, not just electric poles, which aren't really a nuisance and hazard, but the high tension wires, tower antenna and the fall distance, wells, things of that nature. And since it's fairly new, we're all going to be learning about these. So I would consider that a red flag if you have any of these on or close to your site. You are going to be looking for distressed vegetation, unusual smells, monitoring wells, and ponding. Ponding is a week after the rain, you still have surface water. It may indicate a high water table. It may indicate that you're going to have some drainage issues when you get there. Note this in your report, but I would send a copy of it or an email or take a photo and let your cost analyst architect know about this so that they can start looking at the soil studies there. We talked a little bit about cross-site drainage, runoff to and from our site to and from adjacent sites. This causes problems and issues, and if not addressed with a project that's already constructed, can create litigation issues, and certainly for new construction, it's something that we can address right off the bat. Forewarned is for, I screwed that one up.
Don't worry about it.
If you know ahead of time, you can address it. It's not something that you want to find out afterwards. When I'm walking the perimeter of the site, again, most of what I've already discussed is looking inward, but you're going to be looking at line of sight to neighboring uses, certainly any hazardous uses, incompatible land uses. Above ground storage tanks are going to be of particular interest. And then you're going to refer back to your phase 1 to see if they caught the same factors. Anytime that they don't, that's going to be a red flag, and it's going to require a discussion with the lender and the phase 1 environmental professional as to why they didn't address it, why they missed it, and how is that going to affect their analysis if it wasn't even incorporated into their decision making. When dealing with improved sites, we've got a couple of additional issues. You're going to be doing an interior inspection of the building, whether you do it top to bottom or bottom to top, it's up to you. As an appraiser, I'm used to always getting up to the roof unless it's just not physically feasible. And I always go down into the basement, boiler rooms. I inspect all common areas in between. I walk the hallways. Ground floor, you've got community rooms, rec rooms, offices and restrooms, etc. Be polite, knock on doors if you're going into restrooms of the opposite sex, but you really need to see these. In the upper floors, hallways, you are going to be going into apartments as required. Typically at least one unit type for each unit type, plus handicapped units. And preferably also not merely to see that whatever units are vacant, but you need to get in to see how people live. And quite frankly, when I'm in a building, I consider it a best practice to talk to the tenants. Sometimes in front of management, sometimes off to the side. You find a lot about the building and the behind the scenes look. And quite frankly, management that's comfortable with that is generally running a good building. The interior inspection, you walk the footprint of the building when you go outside. Laura had mentioned it, you look for stress cracks and signs of settling. Quite frankly, if you see that, I almost always go immediately into the interior to see if it goes through the foundation. I'll take a picture of it, again, particularly if my construction analyst isn't with me. I'll send it over to him or her, and they will comment, they will incorporate it into their analysis. I then widen the search along the outside exterior grounds and into the parking lot, again looking for drainage issues, ponding and puddling, and you're always looking for distressed vegetation. You probably won't find crop circles or alien disturbance, but unusual smells, fill pipes sometimes that haven't been accounted for will tell you that there was an underground storage tank there at one time. Maybe it was removed, maybe it wasn't, maybe they left the fill pipe behind. You can get contamination from the fill pipes. Sometimes they run 20, 30 feet to an underground storage tank. Sometimes they're indicative that it's right below. Again, cross-check what you see on the site and during your site inspection with what you see and what you've read in the Phase 1. And you're looking for discrepancies. And if you don't find them, if everything is together, then you're looking to see how it was dealt with. It should be addressed in the Phase 1, not just fill pipe, I don't know what it is. Beyond that, of course, you're looking for above-ground storage tanks, emergency generators, and anything with hydraulic fluids. You'll tend to find that in the garbage area. Emergency generators, they can be encased or enclosed and have small amounts, 100, 250 gallons for propane or diesel fuel. In general, they are considered accessory uses to the subject property, necessary for the if there's a power shortage. I'm usually more comfortable when they're enclosed, and if I see an open tank, I'm also more comfortable if it's farther away. I don't necessarily have to do an acceptable separation distance, but HUD policy has changed over the years, and there's a time when we did have to address that concern. You're then going to walk the perimeter of the site right next to the adjacent properties, and there you're again looking for cross-site runoff to and from our site, and you're checking out the line of sight with neighboring uses, above-ground storage tanks, hazardous uses, etc. After that, you're still not done because you're finished basically with the subject property, but you're moving on to the neighborhood. And I want you to be safe and wise. You can walk the neighborhood in a lot of safe neighborhoods, but there are times when I've been in distressed urban areas and I'm more comfortable doing a neighborhood tour in the car. So I go back to the car, lock the doors, and I drive the immediate neighborhood. But in general, even in the worst neighborhoods, I've been okay at least walking just off the adjacent site across the street and inspecting neighboring properties. You really want to know how the subject fits into the neighborhood or how it's likely to fit into the neighborhood. You can get new construction in an urban zone where there's been fire damage, they've taken the building down, and they want to reuse the site for residential use. So is it going to be high-rise in an area of low-rise, single-family homes? Do you have mixed-use commercial? And for sure, you're going to be looking at vacant and abandoned buildings in distressed neighborhoods. It's part of our goal to revitalize and bring these neighborhoods back, but is it the right use for the subject property and the funds that we're going to be insuring? Particularly if somebody wants to put a luxury high-rise in an area that really doesn't support that kind of lifestyle with no infrastructure in place. That tends to be more of a marketability from the appraiser point of view, but if you're doing the site inspection, you want to make note of this. After that, I drive up to 1 mile north, south, east, and west. Again, 1 mile is sufficient for a rural or suburban area. What you really want to do, though, is get out of the immediate neighborhood and see what you can't see from line of sight from the subject property and from the neighborhood. 1 mile basically takes you to most of the influences that will be impacting your site. As we know, we're looking at highways and heavily traveled roadways, thoroughfares up to 1,000 feet away. And we're looking at railroad tracks. Busy roads and highways, 1,000 feet. Railroad tracks, 3,000 feet. Civil airports, 5 miles. You may not get to that, but you should certainly know what's going on in that area. Municipal airports, we kind of covered it a little bit under civilian. They're not civil, but they're airports, and there are rules and regulations dealing with what's going on if you're in close proximity to them. So I would be mindful of that, and you can very often see this on your map, but you want to go and visit the site and see if it conforms to the neighborhood and the community at large. As I said, cross-check with the county map. It's a good idea to know the location of parks, police, fire, and commercial retail. These are supportive uses to most of our subject properties. And you just want to know, again, how the subject is going to fit in from a marketability perspective. Do the people have to drive to these influences, these amenities and services at the community level? Or can they take a shuttle bus? Finish your sample field notes checklist. There's nothing more frustrating than to think that you have everything and to travel back to the office 3-4 hours away and realize that something as simple as, were there streetlights on the site in front of me? Are there sidewalks? Was there drainage in the street? And gee, I have to do a traffic study now, and what was the speed limit? Where's the nearest traffic light? Nothing's more frustrating because you're really not going to be able to get that from the phase one, and maybe you can call the lender. Best practice for me has always been to get when I'm talking to on-site management, to get their business card. I give them mine in case they come up with something that they may feel is relevant. And then get home safely. Most important thing at the end of the day. I'll pause for any questions.
On anything?
On anything.
Okay, we have one. If an appraiser does the site inspection and the underwriter does the HEROES entries, who signs it in HEROES? Very good question.
That is a good question.
Yes.
As the HEROES
Expert.
I'd say I'm agnostic on this issue. I think I'd make it a program call who would sign as the preparer. It would be, the same as the 4128.
Yes.
Whoever.
So there is an answer to it.
Oh, great.
Basically the underwriter, because the underwriter, whoever's doing the 4128 is doing the environmental compliance. They're doing their due diligence, checking all the facts within the lender's submission and the application, and looking at all the laws and compliance. So they're the one who is taking an ownership role of the HEROES document. Whoever did the site inspection would do something. As I mentioned, I said sign the sample field notes checklist, but if you've gotten away from that, there should be a notation in HEROES as to who conducted the site inspection, what day they conducted it on, and perhaps what their qualifications were. We had the appraiser look at it, we had a cost analyst look at it. They did the site inspection on such and such a day, and they're responsible for that part of the HEROES. But they may not be signing off on it. And right now, HEROES doesn't have a setup for to split this out. And quite frankly, it wasn't really set up in the HUD 4128 either. But almost always, when we're signing a HUD 4128, and I've seen a number of them, somebody mentioned at some point that they didn't do the site inspection, somebody else did. And that's a relevant piece of information for public oversight.
So just document.
I would agree with those answers, and just observe that if you have any questions in the unusual event that you have someone different doing the site visit than is filling out the HEROES submission, just consult with the tech support branch chief and resolve it, and then check in with HUD headquarters tech support if any questions or concerns in this area.
Good. Thank you, Dan. All right, well, I see we have no further questions, and so we have actually finished everything that is involved in conducting an environmental review. We have gone through the 50.4 laws and authorities, we have gone through the environmental assessment factors, and we've gone through actually doing a site visit. So we are going to take a 15-minute break, and then we're going to come back and we're going to talk about some specific case studies, yes, for a little bit. And then that's how we're going to finish the day. Do you have anything else?
No.
All
We're
right,
right on
let's-
schedule, so we'll be
Are
back
we?
at 2.
15 minutes.
Yeah.
2 o'clock. We'll be back at 2 o'clock. Thank you.